On the weekend of March 14th, 2026, while American and Israeli warplanes were conducting bombing runs over Iranian territory, a quieter but potentially equally consequential scene was unfolding in a meeting room in Cairo. Envoys from Donald Trump's Board of Peace, the initiative created to manage post-war Gaza, sat across from representatives of Hamas. The fact that this meeting happened at all, given the circumstances surrounding it, tells you something about how desperate both sides are to prevent the Gaza ceasefire from collapsing entirely. But what emerged from those talks, and the ultimatum Hamas delivered during them, reveals just how close that collapse may actually be. To understand why these Cairo meetings carry such weight, you need to grasp the scale of what changed on February 28, 2026. That was the day the United States and Israel launched a coordinated bombing campaign against Iran. The strikes targeted military installations, nuclear-related sites, and critically, Iran's Karg Island, the coral outcrop in the Persian Gulf that handles roughly 90% of Iranian crude oil exports. The operation was massive in scope, and the response from Tehran was immediate. Iran's new supreme leader, Mujtaba Khamenei, declared that the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's oil passes daily, would remain closed until the strikes stopped. Global oil prices surged. Gulf states that had positioned themselves as partners in the Gaza reconstruction effort suddenly found themselves within range of Iranian rocket fire. And the fragile diplomatic architecture that had been painstakingly assembled to manage Gaza's transition out of war began to buckle under pressures it was never designed to withstand. Multiple attempts to mediate the Iran conflict have gone nowhere. Oman and Egypt both tried to open communication channels for a ceasefire, and the Trump administration rejected both efforts outright. The White House has made its position clear. The military campaign to degrade Tehran's capabilities will continue until the mission is complete. Iran, for its part, has refused to engage in any ceasefire discussions until American and Israeli airstrikes stop permanently. Neither side is budging. And every day the war continues, the ripple effects spread further into Gaza, into the Gulf economies funding reconstruction, into the shipping lanes that keep global energy markets functional. What started as a bilateral military campaign is rapidly becoming the organizing crisis of the entire region. Which brings us back to the Board of Peace and what it was supposed to accomplish before the Iran war consumed everything around it. Trump established the Board of Peace to oversee post-war Gaza, the reconstruction, the governance transition, the security arrangements that would follow the ceasefire. The board's ambitions were significant. A 20-point plan for Gaza's future, backed by billions of dollars in pledged funding from international contributors. The United States alone committed $10 billion. Contributing nations collectively pledged an initial $7 billion as a down payment toward a reconstruction effort estimated to ultimately cost $70 billion. The United Nations earmarked $2 billion for humanitarian assistance. Even FIFA pledged $75 million for soccer-related infrastructure projects in the enclave. The total financial commitment on paper was staggering. The board itself features a heavy Middle Eastern presence. Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, leads the diplomatic efforts. Nikolay Mladenov, a senior board official, has been overseeing applications for a transitional Palestinian police force, one of the concrete steps toward the new governance structure the plan envisions. Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto pledged up to 8,000 troops to an international stabilization force that would help maintain order during the transition period. On paper, it represents an ambitious framework for transforming a devastated territory into something resembling stability. But there were structural problems that existed even before the Iran war made everything worse. The board's founding membership notably excludes Palestinian representatives, a gap that has drawn sustained criticism from multiple quarters, and raises fundamental questions about whose interests the plan ultimately serves. Several key Western allies of the United States have declined to join, expressing concerns about the initiative's scope and the precedent it sets. And Trump's indication that the Board of Peace would eventually tackle conflicts beyond Gaza, expanding into other global hotspots, has generated anxiety that the initiative could undermine the United Nations' established role in international diplomacy. The board was already operating on contested ground before the region erupted into a wider war. Now, with that war reshaping every calculation, those structural weaknesses are becoming harder to paper over. Consider what the Iran conflict has done to the financial commitments underpinning the entire Gaza plan. Countries like the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, which had pledged substantial funds toward reconstruction, are reportedly reassessing those commitments. The reason is straightforward. These nations now face potential Iranian rocket fire directed at their own territory. When your own ports and critical infrastructure are within range of ballistic missiles, the calculus around sending billions of dollars to rebuild a neighboring territory shifts dramatically. The $7 billion in initial pledges, which seemed like a solid foundation just weeks ago, now looks considerably less certain. Donor fatigue was always a risk with a $70 billion reconstruction effort. Donor survival instincts are something else entirely. If you're following the connections between the Iran war, the collapsing reconstruction framework, and the fate of millions of people in Gaza, drop your perspective in the comments, because the decisions being made right now will shape outcomes that persist for years. And then there is the disarmament question, arguably the single most critical component of Trump's entire Gaza plan, and the one that has been most directly disrupted by the regional war. The core deal was straightforward in concept, if extraordinarily difficult in execution. Hamas militants would lay down their weapons in exchange for amnesty. Disarmament was the mechanism through which the ceasefire would transition from a temporary pause in fighting to a permanent end of hostilities. Without it, the ceasefire remains exactly what it is now: fragile, conditional, and reversible at any moment either side decides the arrangement no longer serves its interests. On the day the Iran war began, disarmament negotiations were paused. The White House has publicly denied this, with an official stating that discussions are, quote, ongoing and positive. But a Hamas official confirmed directly that the talks are frozen. And the evidence on the ground supports the freeze rather than the White House's characterization. In the absence of active disarmament negotiations, Hamas has been reasserting control over areas within the enclave. Reports indicate that Hamas forces recently ambushed members of Israeli-backed militia groups in both northern and southern Gaza, actions that are entirely inconsistent with a group preparing to surrender its weapons. Whatever diplomatic language is being used to describe the state of those talks, the reality inside Gaza tells a different story. Israeli officials, meanwhile, have not softened their position. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has stated publicly that Hamas will be disarmed peacefully or forcefully, language that leaves almost no room for the kind of incremental, trust-building negotiation that disarmament actually requires. The gap between Israel's stated position and Hamas's behavior on the ground is widening every day. And the Iran war has effectively removed the diplomatic pressure that might have kept both sides moving toward compromise. Each side is now looking at the other through the lens of a regional war that has hardened positions across the board. There is another layer to this that demands attention, because it shows how the physical infrastructure of diplomacy itself can collapse just as quickly as the political willingness to engage. The Iran war has caused severe flight disruptions across the region. Mediators who need to shuttle between capitals, Cairo, Doha, Riyadh, Jerusalem, are finding it increasingly difficult to travel. The U.S.-led Civil Military Coordination Center in southern Israel, which served as an operational hub for coordinating humanitarian and diplomatic efforts related to Gaza, has scaled back to minimal operations due to concerns over Iranian missile strikes on Israeli territory. The people, the facilities, and the transportation networks that make negotiations physically possible are all degrading in real time. You cannot negotiate disarmament if your negotiators cannot get to the table. It was against this backdrop, frozen talks, degraded logistics, and escalating regional war, that the Cairo weekend meetings took place. Arya Lightstone, an American aide representing the Board of Peace, attended Gaza-related meetings with Hamas representatives on March 14th and 15th. The fact that these meetings happened, despite every logistical and political obstacle working against them, is itself notable. But what happened inside those meetings matters far more than the fact that they occurred. Hamas delivered a clear ultimatum. If Israel maintains the new border restrictions it imposed on Gaza when the Iran war began, Hamas will walk away from its previous ceasefire commitments. The group stated explicitly that it believes Israel is exploiting the broader regional conflict to evade its obligations under Trump's plan. In Hamas's reading of the situation, the war has given Israel cover to tighten its grip on the enclave under the guise of security concerns, and the Board of Peace is either unable or unwilling to prevent it. Whether that reading is accurate or strategically convenient for Hamas is a separate question, but the ultimatum itself is real, and it introduces a concrete timeline pressure on negotiations that did not exist before the Cairo talks. The most tangible outcome of those meetings was Israel's announcement that it would reopen the sole pedestrian crossing between Gaza and Egypt at Rafah. Israel had shut Gaza's borders entirely when the Iran war started, citing safety concerns. Following the talks, and presumably under some degree of pressure from the board's envoys, Israel agreed to reopen the crossing after completing what it described as a security assessment. It is a limited concession, one pedestrian crossing, not full border access, not the resumption of commercial goods flowing into the territory. But it represents the first concrete reversal of the wartime restrictions that Hamas has been protesting. For the civilians inside Gaza who depend on that crossing for movement, medical access, and family connections to Egypt, it is not nothing. But relative to the scale of what is unraveling around it, it is very far from enough. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. The intersection of these crises is going to define the trajectory of the Middle East for the foreseeable future, and the dynamics shift week by week. The question now is whether the Rafah reopening signals a genuine willingness on Israel's part to ease restrictions, or whether it is a tactical gesture designed to buy time while the broader regional war continues and the board's leverage erodes. The answer will likely determine whether the Gaza ceasefire survives the next several weeks. The strategic risks are accumulating at an alarming pace. The continued U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz threaten to pull Gulf donor nations into a wider conflict, putting the entire reconstruction funding framework in jeopardy. If the $7 billion in pledged funds evaporates, the Board of Peace loses its primary tool for incentivizing cooperation on the ground, and the $70 billion vision for Gaza's future becomes little more than an aspirational document. Hamas has explicitly threatened to abandon the ceasefire if restrictions are not eased, and they now have a politically convenient justification for doing so in Israel's wartime border closures. And within the United States, surging gasoline prices, driven by the Hormuz closure, are creating domestic political pressure on the Republican Party ahead of midterm elections. Pressure that could force a premature shift in strategy, disrupting both the Iran campaign and the Gaza negotiations simultaneously. Every one of these risks reinforces the others, creating a feedback loop where the failure of any single element increases the likelihood that the others fail too. There are, however, narrow strategic opportunities embedded within the crisis. and they deserve honest assessment rather than dismissal. The reopening of Rafah, limited as it is, creates an immediate window to surge humanitarian aid into Gaza, potentially building goodwill with the civilian population and demonstrating that the Board of Peace can deliver tangible results even under wartime conditions. If that window is used effectively, it could provide a counter-narrative to Hamas's argument that the board is powerless against Israeli restrictions. Board of Peace officials have also advanced a more controversial strategic argument, one worth watching closely as events unfold. They contend that degrading Iran's military capabilities through the ongoing strikes could ultimately accelerate Hamas's disarmament by severing the group's primary financial and military supply line. If Iran's ability to fund and arm Hamas is substantially reduced, the reasoning goes, Hamas's leverage at the negotiating table diminishes, and the terms of disarmament become more favorable to the board's objectives. The war against Iran, in this framing, is not an obstacle to the Gaza plan, but an enabler of it. That argument carries a certain strategic logic, but it depends on a very specific sequence of events unfolding in a very specific order. Iran's capabilities must be degraded significantly before the Gaza ceasefire collapses, before donor funding evaporates, before Hamas consolidates its position beyond the point of negotiated reversal, and before domestic political pressures in the United States force a change in course. The margin for that sequence to play out successfully is exceptionally thin, and there are multiple actors with both the motivation and the means to disrupt it. What the Cairo meetings ultimately reveal is a diplomatic architecture trying to function in conditions it was never built for. The Board of Peace was designed for a post-war environment, a Gaza where fighting had stopped, where borders were open, where international funding was flowing, and where the primary challenge was convincing armed groups to trade their weapons for amnesty and a seat at whatever political table emerged. Instead, the board now operates in the shadow of a regional war that has closed borders, frozen the most critical negotiations, threatened the funding base, disrupted the logistics of diplomacy itself, and given every party involved, Israel, Hamas, Iran, the Gulf states, fresh reasons to reassess their commitments and recalculate their positions. The envoys who sat down with Hamas in Cairo were not operating from a position of strength. They were attempting to hold together a framework that is cracking under pressures applied from every direction simultaneously. The Rafah reopening was a real outcome, meaningful for the civilians who depend on that crossing, meaningful as a signal that some degree of negotiation is still possible. But it is small relative to the scale of what is unraveling around it. If someone you know is trying to understand why the Middle East feels like it is spiraling in multiple directions at once, share this with them. These interconnected crises are shaping outcomes that affect energy markets, refugee flows, and the broader international order far beyond the region itself. The ceasefire in Gaza is not dead. The Cairo meetings proved that channels of communication still exist, and that both sides recognize the cost of total collapse. But the distance between a ceasefire that technically holds and a process that delivers genuine stability for the people living inside that territory is vast. And it is growing wider with every day the Iran war continues. Every day the borders remain restricted. Every day the disarmament talks remain frozen. And every day the financial commitments that were supposed to rebuild Gaza sit in limbo. The question hanging over all of it is whether diplomacy can build faster than war can destroy. And right now, the war is winning that race.